Good evening, comrades. Thanks for joining us to the Online Communist Forum. As always, we're going to have a report by the PCC delivered by Jack Conrad, and we welcome disagreements, debates, questions afterwards. Over to you, Jack.
Okay, thanks. Well, I'll begin with just noting this is the first anniversary of Evgeny Prizogin's death. You remember him, Wagner, the march on Moscow in June 2023. And then, I can remember writing a commentary on that march and saying to him, Evgeny, be careful that, when you're in a building, make sure it's on the first floor. Don't go anywhere high. I was the last to predict that he would get blown out of the sky. But yes, it's a frequent occurrence, isn't it, for anyone who crosses Vladimir Putin, that they end up dead. But of course, there were, as you would expect at the time, those on the pro-Kremlin left that said that this Wagner coup was a brilliant move because it would allow Putin to centralize the military and get rid of Wagner. And my own take on it was that this wasn't a brilliant move, but actually a sign of the weakness of the regime. And I have the same reaction to the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. This is August the 7th. I have to say that I'm still in a position, as I said in this week's article, that I'm completely in the dark when it comes to how on earth Ukrainian forces so easily penetrated Russian defenses. I thought for a moment, am I mistaken? Have I been writing, over all of these months about Russia digging, dragon's teeth, tank traps, minefields, kill zones, and all the rest of it, not only along the 1,000-kilometer hot front between Ukrainian and Russian forces inside Ukraine, but also I've been making the point that these defenses run all the way up the internationally recognized border separating Ukraine and Russia, all the way up the east and all the way along the north. So I thought to myself for one moment, that am I mistaken here? Anyway, I consulted various, what you'd call credible websites, and no, there they are on the maps. This is from satellite images. 2 lines of Russian defenses in terms of Kursk, one directly on the border, one further back. Now, of course, what these 2 lines of defenses are, they're actually behind Ukrainian lines. And again, as I mentioned in this week's article in the Weekly Worker, there are adverts in the Russian media calling upon workers who want to risk their lives for, I don't know how many rubles, but not much in the way of dollars. I don't know how that counts in Russia. Go out there and dig trenches in Kursk. And indeed, there are now satellite images with the new lines of defenses. And my understanding is that similar moves are being made in the Ukrainian side to dig. So it looks at least like to me that what we've got is another front in this war. It looks like it isn't going to be simply in and out, as has been the case with, anti-Kremlin Russian forces based in Ukraine. They've made incursions into other oblasts. So it seems to me that this is going to be something in the way of an occupation. It would seem to me that we'd be very soon into, back into static warfare. So why did Zelensky give the go-ahead? Well, one, I think it's about propaganda. It's about showing that the Putin FSB regime in Moscow is vulnerable, that it cannot protect Russian lands. I think it was also an attempt to divert Russian forces from what I'll call the Eastern Front, where Russian forces have been making steady, although painfully slow and hugely costly advances throughout the summer. There's no sign at the moment that their advances, slow though they are, have stopped, although there is evidence of them bringing in new forces into Kursk. Okay. Now, reading the Financial Times, we're assured that this particular operation in Kursk was the result of close consultations between only a few people. And I'm not convinced that this didn't involve Western advisors. The Financial Times says that they weren't involved, but I have to say that they would say that, wouldn't they? i.e. the Ukrainian side is not going to boast about Western advisors, and I suppose the West isn't going to boast about actually encouraging Ukrainian attack on Russian soil. So what to make of this incursion? I think there's a third factor which we also ought to mention, and that is, of course, dependent on the election in the United States in November. I mean, I haven't got a clue who's going to win, other than it's most likely going to be Kamala Harris or it's going to be Donald Trump. I think I'm on a pretty safe bet there. But I do think that Zelensky, looking at the situation in the United States, is saying, yes, Trump could win and Trump could try. I don't think he will succeed myself in negotiating a peace deal within 48 hours. But nonetheless, having a situation of where it isn't only Russian forces that are in control of Ukrainian land, having a situation of where Ukrainian forces are also in control of Russian land, then perhaps we could do a deal. Perhaps we could trade land for land, POWs for POWs. Who knows? But I do think that that at least is a third factor to consider. And indeed, we've just had in Kiev, Modi, the Prime Minister of India, having given Vladimir a bear hug, he's gone on to give Vladimir a bear hug as well. And India seems to be putting itself forward as an honest broker. There's been some trade deals, there's been some agreement to deliver, Indian aid, humanitarian aid to Ukraine. But at the same time, we've had a demonstration that India remains close to Russia. That's been a historic ally. If you look at the Indian military, overwhelmingly, it's supplied with Russian gear. So India could put itself forward as a neutral under these circumstances, where clearly the United States can't, Europe can't. And indeed, it's worth noting, isn't it, that India did attend the Swiss peace conference organized by Ukraine, but didn't sign up to the final declaration. The declaration that Modi and Zelensky signed, on the other hand, in Ukraine, mentioned the UN Charter, but emphasized the need for peace. And this shows a shift on the Ukrainian side. It wasn't that long ago that Ukraine was insisting that every last man, every last inch of territory needs to be conceded, and only then would there be peace negotiations. That has shifted. It's shifted under American instructions. So clearly, it's not impossible to imagine some sort of deal at some point in the not too distant future. On the other hand, it isn't that difficult to imagine this war going on and on and on. And so although, I can speculate, and I have, about the possibility of Russia taking this town or that town while the fighting season lasts, that really is up to autumn, so it's not that much longer. But having done that, then turning its attention to the south and the possibility of cutting off Ukraine from the Black Sea. But I have to say that if that was going to be achieved, at least at the present rate of advance, that would take an awful long time, perhaps into the next decade. So who knows? This war could be finished through peace negotiations, or it could simply drag on and on and on. Meanwhile, what America seems to be banking on, though, is regime change in Russia. I don't think anyone sees a military defeat for either side. I've heard talk of Ukraine just about to collapse. I'm not convinced. But equally, if you look at this Kursk offensive, of course, it's produced you the Western media, which are coming out with the opposite line, that the Putin regime, its days are numbered. Kursk shows that Putin is just about to fall. I'm not convinced of that, although we shouldn't discount it as a possibility. It just seems to me that we're not in a position to judge. And if there was going to be such a change, I think we'd need to see the sort of telltale signs of movement away from Putin, splits in the regime, splits in the army, and other than Wagner, we don't seem to have any evidence towards such a thesis whatsoever. Okay, this is a very quick instant comment. When I made my notes last night, it hadn't happened, but in terms of our discussion on the PCC, I was informed, don't you know, about Lebanon? And I had to confess that no, I hadn't listened to the news this morning. And so I've very quickly had a look, and you know more than I do. We've had 100 Israeli jets launch what is called a preemptive strike. And what is this, a preemptive strike against? A Hezbollah attack on northern Israel. Well, let's be clear what is meant there. This isn't tens of thousands of Hezbollah fighters crossing the frontier and invading northern Israel. That wasn't going to happen. That isn't going to happen. What we were clearly talking about is Israel preempting missile attacks, drone attacks. What happened as a result of these 100 aircraft going in and taking out this, that, and the other? Hundreds of missiles, hundreds of drones, of course, were delivered from southern Lebanon by Hezbollah forces. So tit for tat, but a definite escalation. I think we have to say, and I said it last week, there's absolutely no chance of the Blinken, Biden, call it whatever you will, peace deal. It wasn't going to happen. it isn't going to happen, at least anytime soon. America could make it happen by switching off the arms to Israel. It is doing no such thing. And so Israel is not only intent on keeping fighting in Gaza. The war aims aren't to get back every hostage. That was never the aim, nor is it to destroy Hamas. That's impossible, as Netanyahu's own defense minister, fellow member of Likud, has made it absolutely clear you cannot do that. But an Israeli presence, an Israeli terror regime in Gaza, that is something that Israel can sustain. I think Netanyahu and his coalition partners are determined to do that. And upping the war, upping the ante, is also something Netanyahu seems determined to do. He seems determined, at least from my angle, to either get the United States involved before the election, but on the hope that it is Trump elected. So it's Netanyahu hoping that Trump is elected. And I think you'd have to say, in all honesty, although he's denied it to Tucker Carlson, I think you also have to say that Putin would prefer a Trump victory. But we're also told by the media that there's a possibility of an all-out regional war. I think we need to be clear what is meant by that. It isn't Iran sending its navy into the Mediterranean to bombard Israel from the sea. It's not Iran about to send its tanks over into Israel. No, this is about Israel launching a war in southern Lebanon, maybe going further, but also launching a war on Iran. One would expect airports, communications, military bases, and perhaps its nuclear facilities to be attacked. But the aim clearly is to try to drag the United States in. And at the moment, I think that word dragged is accurate. I don't see any thirst by the Democrats, i.e. Biden or Kamala Harris, to actually, preempt or not preempt, to actually push Israel into such an action. I think the opposite is happening. Okay, a very quick comment in terms of British politics, pensions and fuel. Remember, there's not going to be a parliamentary vote on this £300 cut for millions of pensioners. At the moment, something like 11.5 million people who were in receipt of this £300 universal payment. There's only 1.5 million people amongst pensioners who are on credit. That's a means tested benefit, and that would go hand in hand with a winter fuel payment. So Rachel Reeves has abolished that, and at the same time, as her civil servants would have told her, the authorities have announced actually that the price cap is going up, and therefore the charge, electricity and gas charge that people have to bear has gone up from £1,568 and to £1,717. So roughly speaking, pensioners have been hit with a £500 cut, which is quite substantial. Now, I know that there are some rich pensioners, there's no doubt about that. But on average, there'll be an awful lot of pensioners that are just above the pension credit limit, and therefore will definitely face a choice this winter, especially if it's a severe winter, between putting the heating on and eating. And of course, you cannot afford not to eat So people will be switching the heating off. And of course, depending on where you are, depending on how severe the winter is, that is a killer, especially for the particularly elderly or people who are elderly and infirm. And it's interesting, isn't it? It's not surprising. That's what opposition parties are meant to do. But we have Rishi Sunak, the Tories, the Telegraph, the Daily Mail, all leading the charge to protect pensioners. Now, it's true that on average, pensioners are more likely to vote Tory than they are Labour or Lib Dem or Green. But the fact of the matter is that it was the right-wing press all the way through the Rishi Sunak government and going back that were talking about, well, we can't afford the triple lock. All these universal benefits. This apparently is discrimination in favor of rich people. Well, for rich people, this benefit is marginal. And then you have to also take into account, of course, once you go over to a means test, you've got to administer it. Universal has the great advantage of simplicity, and also it avoids stigma. People don't like feeling that they're sort of somehow scrounging, because that's what the right-wing media talks about when it comes to benefits. As for us in the CPGB, we stand for universal benefits. We're not in favor of means-tested benefits. We're also in favor of linking the pension to the minimum wage, our minimum wage, by the way, not the current minimum wage. And we're also, and I think this is worthwhile saying, we're also in favor of earlier retirement if one wants to. So, for example, we're in favor of, if you're in a particular hazardous or a particular occupation that takes a great deal of physical energy. So, for example, a firefighter, we are definitely in favor of the right of firefighters or miners. We used to have miners in Britain being able to retire at 55. But in general, we favor 60, but also the right of people, if they want to receive a pension, but also to keep working. And I think that's right. People should have the right to pursue their hobbies, go for long walks, look after the grandkids, but also if they want to and they enjoy their work, they ought to have the right, if they can keep doing it, to keep doing it. Quick comment on the Labour Party. I couldn't resist it. There's a new set of statistics just being released by the Parliamentary authorities. Parliamentarians are obliged to declare how much income they get from various sources. And amongst the requirements that they're under is to declare that if they get more than £10,000 a year from renting out properties, i.e., are you a member of the rentier class? And it turns out that in this parliament, there are something like 85 MPs that are classified as rentiers. Amongst them, the biggest is 44 Labour MPs. That's 11% of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Tories now, of course, much diminished numbers, a mere 25 of them. Nonetheless, a significant percentage of the Parliamentary Conservative Party. Liberal Democrats, 8 out of 72 MPs. At the top of the list, we actually have Jazz Athnal. Where's he from? I think he's from Redbridge. That's right, Redbridge in East London. That would include Dagenham. And he was previously the council leader in Dagenham, and he replaced what the Financial Times called a Corbyn ally. That's Sam Tarry. I don't remember him being a Corbyn ally. I remember him being, wasn't the whip withdrawn when he went on an ASLEF picket? But I have to say, I think we wrote in the Weekly Worker that perhaps one of the reasons why he rediscovered his industrial militancy was because he was under threat of a selection. There was a reselection process going on. But yeah, amongst the top 5, there are 3 Labour MPs. And I think this does show something of a change in the Parliamentary Labour Party. If we think about the Parliamentary Labour Party in the not so recent past, there would be plenty of MPs who come from a trade union background. I think that's, massively declined over the years. And instead what you get is people more or less directly in from universities, from student unions. Okay, they might have served as, in a trade union office, but more often what they do, they go straight into Parliament as an advisor, as a bag carrier for some minister or aspiring minister. But there is this new element of what I would call the petty bourgeoisie that have moved in to the Labour Party. And in that context, I suppose you would count the leader of the Labour Party, the Scottish Labour Party, Anna Sawar. He's worth, because he's got a 25% stake in his family's cash and carry business, he's worth, in terms of his share holdings, between 2.7 and 4.8 million. Now that sounds like quite a lot. On the other hand, think about it in terms of what actual income he's likely to get from it. We are talking about the lower end of the bourgeoisie. That's why I think it would be fair to call it the petty-bourgeoisification of the Labour Party. The bourgeoisification of the Labour Party has been a permanent feature, and that involves politics. So the Labour Party has always been politically bourgeois, but what we're talking about is a change, I think, in the sort of petty bourgeois layer in the Labour Party, i.e. trade union officials who live a petty bourgeois lifestyle, who play a petty bourgeois intermediate role between capital and labour, being replaced by people who are clearly on the bourgeois side of things, who actually live, at least in part, from renting and from capital. Okay, and then I have to mention, of course, not the richest person in Parliament, that still is Rishi Sunak, as far as I am aware, but also Margaret Hodge, ex-MP, now member of the House of Lords. And she is worth who knows how much, but the Google I came up with was $100 million. And that's a result of her being a shareholder in her family's still a business that goes all the way back to, believe it or not, Egypt. Her family were Jewish entrepreneurs, capitalists in Egypt, who eventually made their way, at least her side of the family, eventually made their way to England. Okay, moving on. What's the time? 29, so I've got enough time. Just thought it would be worthwhile dealing with a couple of issues raised in this week's Weekly Worker. We've got the article Nature's Gift to Humanity by Comrade Emil Jacobs. To me, this reads like, how should we put it, publicity. I'm not suggesting it for a moment, but it reads like publicity sponsored by the nuclear industry. to save nature, to save humanity, we've got to invest big in nuclear. And nuclear almost doesn't seem to be able to do anything wrong. Either way, I'm accused of not misrepresentation when it comes to the facts, but putting things in a biased way. This is a reference to my last article on the green question, on global climate and all the rest of it, on techno fixes. Now, my main target in that article actually wasn't the nuclear industry, but I did note renewed enthusiasm for it. But it was the main target was basically changing the climate, geo-engineering. And I was basically saying, look, this is dangerous. You might be able to tweak it, but all the evidence tends to indicate that things are a lot more complex than models can actually predict what the outcome would be. In other words, there's a danger, according to various commentators, and I'm talking about scientific commentators, not politicians such as myself, that you put up, for example, an eye shade over the world, cost of $5 trillion. Who knows what impact that would have in terms of the climate system? No one really knows. Certainly, if you shoot up sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere, it could have the effect of just turning down the thermostat a degree, or I should put it, a fraction of a degree or so, maybe. On the other hand, if we actually look at a volcano such as Krakatoa, it was responsible for something like a 3-degree drop in global temperatures when it comes to the northern hemisphere. And of course, that impacts on crops, it impacts on, I should put it, biodiversity, and not just for 1 year, but for several years. So the impact is unpredictable. It's not an exact science. And then I looked at nuclear and simply said, well, at the moment, it's clear that nuclear is a lot more expensive than renewables, in particular wind and solar. And of course, it's dangerous. And when it comes to the holy grail, i.e. nuclear fusion, it's 20 years away, and it's always been 20 years away ever since it was first mentioned as a potential replacement for nuclear fission, which of course lets off an awful lot of dangerous byproducts that have to be buried, have to be stored, have to be guarded. Either way, this is what the comrade was aiming at. Really? Is nuclear that much more expensive? Well, when we look at the figures for LCOE, that's levelized costs, it's true, he says, and it is true, that nuclear comes in something like 4 times as expensive. Now, none of these figures are exact because, different parts of the world, more advanced, smaller, more compact, you'll get different figures. So none of this is, exact. It's a ballpark a figure. But then he says, but if we include firming costs, which is the cost of putting in the infrastructure, putting in the power lines, then things even out much more. And that's most certainly true. Nonetheless, having admitted that is the case, we're still dealing with a situation of where I don't think there's any argument that nuclear is still very expensive. If we take wind farms, if we take solar farms, for example, because they tend to be dispersed, you have to put in new infrastructure. That means in a country like Britain, we know it's going to be happening now. An awful lot more power lines, an awful lot more pylons are going to have to be put in place. And that has to be included in any reasonable assessment of cost. Okay, so having conceded that, what I think it's worthwhile doing, and again, this is just, how should I put it, just what came up in when I Googled nuclear power costs versus solar, etc. This is the first Google site I came up with, but it seems to be a respectable site, and that's the Australian site of its science agency plus its energy market operators. And they claim, and I'm not in a position to either confirm it or deny it, but it seems reasonable to take it on face value. Maybe I'm naive, that this is technically neutral. Because what's going on in Australia is a debate about whether to go over to wind and solar. As I understand it, in South Australia, they've abandoned black coal. There's plenty of black coal in Australia. Australia supplies massive amounts of black coal to China. And there's a national debate about basically how to go green, because the old national government, national Liberal government, has been replaced by nice progressive Labour Party government under the former firebrand left-wing leader of the Labour Party. And so there's this debate happening. And here are the figures that they're coming up with in terms of the science agency and the existing operators. And what they say is, look, if you take wind and solar, if you have a 60% coverage, that's a big ask. That's a big ask. But if you go for 60%, then wind and solar comes in between $73, and this is Australian dollars, and $95. If you go for 90% coverage, which is a big ask, okay, Australia is a very sunny country. I don't know about its winds, but they get an awful lot of sunshine. That's my understanding in terms of this continental sized country. If you go for 90% coverage, then the costs rise to around about $128, and this is for million kilowatt hours and all the rest of it. On the other hand, you then get in between going over to solar and wind and nuclear, and I'll come to nuclear in a second. You get the grading of gas, black coal, and various other categories about using gas for peak hour consumption and all the rest of it. Anyway, my main point is that with large nuclear plants, instead of getting a $73 bottom rank, and I do emphasize the bottom rank when it comes to solar, you get a price tag of between $141 to a high of $233, which is and this, by the way, is including costs of infrastructure and all the rest of it. But when it comes to, and this is worthwhile, a worthwhile note, when it comes to small nuclear reactors, which the present Labour government of Keir Starmer is busily trying to sell us in Britain, then at least in Australia, the cost there per, kilowatt, 1,000 kilowatt hours and all the rest of it is something like $230 and up to $382. So to me, there's no argument that, once you include infrastructure, of course, the cost of the cost of wind and solar goes up, but it doesn't go up to anywhere near large nuclear power stations, let alone these mini power stations. We're also told by Comrade Emil, and I must admit I double took on his figure, that nuclear power stations can last 80 years. Now, I'm not in a position to say that he's wrong, except I would say that, well, I'm not quite 80, but in my childhood, we were always being taught about the wonders of nuclear power. I was of that generation. Because in Britain, we had the first civilian power station opened up in my memory. I think it was 1954. But the point about civilian use nuclear power stations, this was sold to us not on the basis of the truth that this was intimately linked in with Britain's drive to compete with the Soviet Union and the United States when it came to being a nuclear power. That was the real purpose of Calder Hall. But we were told that electricity from civilian nuclear power would be so cheap that it wouldn't be worthwhile metering. It wouldn't be worthwhile charging. It would be an abundant and more or less everlasting source of free energy. Well, I've already illustrated the point. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nuclear isn't cheap. It is amongst the most expensive options that we face if we're going to transition off carbon, fossil fuel. So yes, compared with coal, gas, undoubtedly nuclear can be cheaper, but it isn't a cheap option. And then we come to the question of decommissioning. Now, I don't know. I mean, Emil is writing from the Netherlands. I don't know the situation in the Netherlands. I'm not claiming to be an expert, so I'm just doing a quick bit of research. But I have got a memory, and I did recall accurately. Hey, this doesn't sound right to me when he said that decommissioning costs are included in the price that the grid is charged when it comes to nuclear. I'm sure that is true. The problem is, as the Public Accounts Committee in Britain revealed, what's been happening here is that the decommissioning costs have gone through a doubling process. So the cost, for example, of decommissioning Britain's 7 heritage nuclear power stations, which has been done previously under the ownership of the EDF, that's the French energy company, has gone up to 23.5 billion. And the Public Accounts Committee was saying that it looks like those costs will keep climbing. And the problem is that it's not EDF that pays for that. It's something called the National Decommissioning Authority, because the EDF company offloads it at a certain point onto this public body. So no, decommissioning isn't included in it. And all we need to do, and I'm not saying this is an annual cost, but think about Fukushima in Japan. The decommissioning costs of that are projected to be in the region of $235 billion. So a very, very hefty price tag. But also, as the comrade himself says, that given the global climate crisis that there is, and I introduced my last article precisely making that point, that if you look at the IPCC, it's saying that this year, 2024, and the next years until 2028, on a global level, we're expecting temperatures to exceed on average above 1.5 degrees. Now, that was put as a limit back in Paris, that they would keep the the rise in temperatures below that threshold. So it's an arbitrary threshold, I readily admit, but it looks to me, not only will we break that threshold this year, but we'll break it the year after, the year after, the year after, the year after. So we're not dealing, when it comes to the climate crisis, any longer some long-term threat that lies way, way down the line for our children and our children's children. This is something that we're dealing with now, and you need remedies now, not in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 or 50 years time. You need to be doing something now. There's a crisis, and we all know when it comes to the climate, it resembles, it's a proverb I know, but it resembles something like an oil tanker. It takes a long time to turn around, and as a throwaway figure, I used 1,000 years, and I think that's true. When it comes to the melting of the permafrost, when it comes to the melting of glaciers, when it comes to the shrinking of the ice caps, this isn't something that you click a switch and it all goes back to how it was. There's energy contained within the climate system that will keep pushing the global temperatures upwards. So when you look at nuclear, as the comrade himself says, the problem is that they take a long time to build. And all we need to do, I'm not sure, is it Hinkley Point C, our latest one in Britain? First on the drawing board 2007, building work started in 2014. It was due to go online and start putting power into the grid 2024, that's this year. It's going to miss that target, and it isn't going to reach that stage next year, the year after, or the year after that either. And the tendency in the nuclear industry is things take an awful long time, because you come up to there's technical problems, which is beyond me. Either way, that is the history. And I don't know whether I mentioned this. I think I already have, but didn't give the answer. As to how long these things last, and I don't think I gave the answer to that. Again, this is the International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, again, maybe it's biased, maybe it's full of false information. If someone tells me it's a load of rubbish, fair enough. But the figure that they use for the life expectancy of a nuclear power station is between 20 and 40 years, not Comrade Emil's 80. And the precise problem is that if you extend the life of these things, then their safety becomes more and more problematic. And it's true, I suspect, that if we take deaths either directly, but certainly indirectly from fossil fuels, they massively outnumber deaths, either directly or indirectly from the nuclear industry. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Again, talking about my age, I live in London. I've lived in London most of my life. And as a child, I distinctly remember, I live in North London, I live up high, but I distinctly remember London smogs. And just seeing London, and all you could see is St. Paul's sticking out above. And this wasn't just an ordinary fog, this was a killer gas. And you'd come home and, 100 people, usually old people, people with asthma, have died today. Next day, 200 have died. And that excludes, mining accidents and all the rest of it. But all I would say is when Comrade Emil says, well, nuclear is safe. Yeah, I go, yeah. But you have to, as he says, you have to store some of this stuff for hundreds of years. And all I would do is say, well, look at Ukraine, look at Kursk. And what we have is the threat, surely, either deliberately, from one side, bringing the temple down upon them. There's talk about the Kursk nuclear plant, or the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, which is in Russian hands. A nuclear accident, and who knows? We are in the area, after all, of Chernobyl, which did blow. And again, in terms of direct deaths, not that many, but indirectly, who knows? We weren't consuming, after all, Welsh milk. So the idea that we can predict the future, that things are going to be so safe, I think is a mistake. And lastly, I'll reiterate the point that the nuclear industry is very closely associated in terms of expertise, the pool of science and technology with the weapons industry. So, for example, when I heard the Shah of Iran on TV talking about Iran becoming a civilian nuclear power, because at some point oil and gas in Iran would run out, I didn't think to myself, what foresight this man has got. What vision has he got? Because there's no chance, in my view at least, of oil or gas running out anytime soon. I know we had this peak oil nonsense, but the reality was, what went on in my mind is that the Shah has a hankering for nuclear weapons. And so precisely in Australia, we're not just talking about the transition from black coal when it comes to power generation. We're also talking about AUKUS. We're talking about Australia with nuclear submarines, and potentially somewhere down the line, nuclear weapons. And I'll finish with that.
Thank you, Jack. Comrades, if you want to make a contribution or ask a question, please click raise hand. Also, I'd like to encourage comrades to come to the Palestine demonstration on September 7th. And if you can help hand out weekly workers, etc., please get in touch by emailing office@cpgb.org.uk. And before we get the ball rolling, Jack, I've got a question. When we're talking about the benefits for older people, pensioners, etc. What do you think, or what is the CPGB position on the question of universal basic income, which is, often raised again as a potential way out of that question of benefits mean testing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think we've got a minority position. Our position is there in black and white in our draft programme. And that is that pensions should be set on the basis of a universal benefit. You can call it a universal income. It is an income. It comes into you. It's paid to you when you retire, either at 55 or 60. It's linked directly to the minimum wage, our minimum wage, which says that you have to be able to live a full lifestyle. So yeah, we're in favour of a universal basic income, but it isn't that basic. And the problem with a lot of bourgeois advocates of universal basic income is they actually set it at a sort of poverty level, and it becomes a substitute for unemployment benefit, housing benefit. And people basically who claim it are not going to be able to live a full life. It's a way for many bourgeois advocates, make the lazy buggers get a job. And we're basically saying, yeah, there should be a right to work. Of course there should. But also we're in favour of precisely work on the basis of need and all the rest of it. But anyway, so the long and the short answer is no means testing, universal benefits, but universal benefits set at the level of where people can enjoy, and I think that's the right word, enjoy a full life, not just, scrape things together. My guess, for what it's worth, is that while Trump's quite capable of saying one thing, he's also quite capable within 48 hours of doing the exact opposite. So the idea that Trump puts over, about him being the peacemaker and under his watch, well, yeah, but there were some near runs, weren't there, of where he nearly gave the go ahead. And so all I would say is that what the Democrats and Republicans are united on is stopping the rise of China. And I think that what you can then have is, how do you stop the rise of China? One way, for example, is to confront Russia, get it involved in what it's been a quagmire in Ukraine. Another one might conceivably be, I don't know, turn it around, turn Russia around, and it becomes a US ally. But if you do that, you have to give them massive concessions. And whatever Trump thinks, well, what then happens to American jobs? If Russia's allowed to develop and join, for example, the World Trade Organization or whatever. So I don't know is the long and the short, why the particular differences are. But I think when it comes to fundamentals, they're united. And so I could easily imagine, if there was a Trump presidency, Trump's presidency continuing to supply loads of arms to Ukraine. It's conceivable. On the other hand, so expressing my ignorance, but I also suspect that no one actually knows. I don't think there is an answer because it will depend on all, a whole number of different factors, not least, what happens on the battlefield. That's not going to be irrelevant. Just a quick comment. I was going to, in the political report, I must have just turned a piece of paper too quickly and say, oh, well, we've got tons of time, I better deal with the nuclear question. I was going to deal with JFK coming out in support of Trump. So it doesn't look like it will make much difference, but in a tight run race, it could. And I was also going to comment on at least the liberal media going big on Kamala Harris, which isn't a surprise, but they ain't half going for it. So they are really desperate for Trump not to win. But again, it's an open question. Who the hell knows? Just going back, I sort of broadly agree with Mike. When I look at Russia, Ukraine, world politics, I personally don't go, oh, Ukraine is on the verge of falling. I just don't see that. You might as well just look at, what's happened in Kursk and conclude that Russia's just about to collapse. I don't read it that way either. And I don't really agree that you can't hold three possibilities in the air at the same time. You can gain territory in order to negotiate. I don't see why that's incompatible with dealing a propaganda blow against the regime in Moscow. Best troops, yes, deployed. That's certainly true. But you're not going to be using your motorized motorized armor in trenches. And what seems to be happening at the moment is both sides seem to be digging trenches. So yeah, the front is fluid at the moment, but they're not going to keep their tanks in Kursk. They're not going to keep their mechanized brigades in Kursk. You withdraw them and you put troops in to guard the trenches. So different regiments, different, brigades. So they're not trapped in Kursk. They can be redeployed. I don't see that as a particular problem. Maybe they were aiming for the Kursk nuclear power station, or at least, as you were saying, Paul, into artillery range of it to hold a gun to Putin's head. Maybe. I mean, it's perfectly valid piece of speculation, but it is speculation. I've got no clue, but my guess would be, for what it's worth, and it ain't worth very much, my guess is that they were as surprised as I was, and I suspect Putin was and everyone else was, how quick their progress was. I mean, the reports I've read is that they do some shelling of Russian trench formations. They send sappers in, and then they send tanks in, and they get through. I'm just amazed that they got through, and then they find themselves in a situation where they got territory in front of them. So again, I don't know, but we shall see. I mean, I don't know of any evidence of saying this was the strategic aim of this particular operation. Okay, so my basic thesis is here that you asked, Paul, Ukraine can't defeat Russia. Yes, that's absolutely right. It cannot defeat Russia, obviously, because it's a huge country. It's not going to go to Moscow. It cannot defeat them in Ukraine. That is true. But I think it's also true the other way around, that Russia so far, all the evidence is that Russia cannot defeat Ukraine. And, you know, maybe at the beginning, I don't want to give advice to anybody, but maybe if they sent more troops and they were better prepared in phase one, they could get all the way to Kiev. Maybe they could have surrounded it. Maybe they could have forced a surrender of Zelensky and he wouldn't have flown off some. Maybe. But now, no, Russia cannot defeat, doesn't show any evidence of defeating Ukraine. And the idea that Ukraine's about to run out of people. Well, they've just introduced, haven't they, conscription for 25-year-olds. What the hell are these young people not in the army for? If the country's under such dire threat, you mobilize everybody. You mobilize old gits like me, but you also mobilize younger people. You also would mobilize women. There's no evidence of that. So I don't see sort of panic on the Ukrainian side, and precisely as Mike argued. Meanwhile, what you've got is massive amounts of US arms, not just shells, but everything else. Now, I don't think myself that F-16s supplied by Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands and whoever are going to tip any balance. I've always been very skeptical about that, but I do think that precisely the economic and military backing of the United States, the intelligence of the United States, the satellites of the United States, you know, that is a factor we need to put in. So this isn't little Ukraine versus big bully Russia. This is a proxy war with NATO. Exactly. And so if we set a war between NATO, albeit through a proxy, then things, I think, look a lot different. And precisely, I don't expect any time soon. But if you look at this Kursk incursion, it's a morale question. And, you know, all you need to do is pick up your Klautzwitz on war or any other decent study on war, and they will tell you it isn't just numbers. It's not just bullets that, you know, decide battles, let alone wars. It's morale. And, you know, anyone who tells me that morale at the moment in Russia is sky high is kidding themselves. The morale, you know, in Putin's circle is sky high. On the other hand, I would suspect that amongst Ukrainian nationalists, at last they're saying we've delivered a blow to the Russian bear, and they're, you know, the morale of their troops will be high as a result of it. Just as with the, that's why I thought I couldn't resist introducing it with the, you know, the Wagner rebellion, that Ukrainian morale would have been boosted by that. And so the idea that, oh, well, Putin sorted that out after a month, it shows you to me how vulnerable the Putin regime is. I mean, what sort of regime is it? It's a regime that I would say fixes presidential elections, fixes other elections, is a regime that isn't deeply rooted in Russia. Remember Putin and his lecture to the oligarchs, the so-called oligarchs: you keep your nose out of politics. Look what happened to Gordievsky. So this isn't a regime with deep roots. It is a FSB regime, military regime, if you want. But even then, so I think it is vulnerable. I don't know. It could last. On the other hand, I think we'd see signs of it if it was going to crack, and I don't see those signs at the moment. But I think the Kursk incursion is precisely a morale boost to the Ukrainian side, but crucially, a morale drop for the Russian side. Now, the Financial Times assures me that Western advisors knew nothing about it. I shrug my shoulders and go, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? But I don't believe it. But I don't know. But that to me would be what they were saying. Well, why don't we do this? We're on the back foot in the Donbass. Why don't we strike them in the soft underbelly? Well, they weren't expecting it. Clearly they weren't. Yeah, I mean, just on Europe, I mean, all you need to say is what Mike said, is it's Nord Stream and the Ukraine war. And I mean, Europe is a sort of Ruritanian setup, isn't it? With vetoes by any particular country. There's no way it can work under its present structure as anything that can coordinate against the United States. But I would say that, with the Ukraine war, Germany has paid the biggest price. It's not the biggest arms supplier. There's no doubt about that. That's the United States. But the country that's, undergone the greatest self-sacrifice, or the greatest self-sacrifice has been imposed upon it, is Germany. It's been, denied cheap Russian gas, which an awful lot of its industry, in terms of its competitiveness, depends on. So my own take on it is that Europe has suffered, Germany in particular has suffered. But just on Paul's basic thesis, look, no one's suggesting that NATO is relying on Ukrainian troops to sort of copy, but this time successfully, Napoleon, and march all the way to Moscow and take Moscow and overthrow the Putin regime. No one's suggesting that. What is being suggested is that Russia doesn't win in Ukraine. And therefore, as a result of that, there's a crisis of regime in Moscow. That's what's being suggested, that in terms of the elite, there's a split. And it's not just a question of Putin. Putin is mortal, everyone's going to die. So he's going to go at some point. But is the regime going to continue, or is it going to split? And I suspect that the calculation is that at some point it will split. Now, that could be wrong. You might have no split in the regime. But at the moment, there's no sign, as far as I can see, that Russia can turn around and say, oh, we're within sight of achieving our goals. We're going to win in Ukraine. I think, I put forward the argument that it looks like to me that Russia can't defeat Ukraine and Ukraine can't defeat Russia. And therefore, what regime would you expect to crack? And I would expect cracks to start in Moscow, but that could be wrong. And just on numbers and all the rest of it, I think this is too simple. So Ukraine was always bound to lose. On that basis, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan were always going to lose. Wars aren't straightforward numbers or GDP or something like that.
Just a reminder, September the 7th, so that's in 2 weeks, next Palestine demonstration. If you can help handing out weekly worker, etc., please get in touch, office@cpgb.org.uk, and we'll see you next Sunday. Bye-bye, comrades.